Welcome to Future Talk. On today's program, we're going to talk about whether social networking technology can advance the cause of peace. I have two guests, both of them from the Peace Innovation Lab at Stanford University. Margarita Quihuis is the current director of the lab. She's also a social entrepreneur and mentor capitalist and former director of a technology incubator for women entrepreneurs. Mark Nelson is a co-founder of the Peace Innovation Lab and also the head of the EPIC Challenge project, which seeks to create an international network of researchers to find ways to increase positive interactions across conflict boundaries. The goal of the Peace Innovation Lab is to reduce the amount of violence in the world using social networking tools and other technologies. The lab is closely related to another organization at Stanford called the Persuasive Technology Lab, and we're going to talk about that as well. So Margarita, how exactly do you use social networking tools to advance the cause of peace?
So in 2009, we launched a project called PeaceDot. And in that project, our goal was to see if we could work with organizations like Facebook and others that gather lots of social data and see with the interactions between people. So with peace.facebook.com, what we persuaded them to do was to look at all the friending activities across conflict boundaries. And what was significant about that was that we were able to see what people actually do versus what we think that they might do or what we might assume that we might do. So we were able to see the number of active daily friendships between, say, Israelis and Palestinians.
Now, how do you know in Facebook, do these people identify themselves on Facebook as being on one side of a conflict?
Yes. So we're looking at their profile data and how they self-identify, and then we can see when people friend each other. And so what Facebook was able to do is aggregate all that data on a daily basis. So they look at friending activity across geographic boundaries, political boundaries, and religious boundaries.
And what does it do with that data?
Right now it just presents it. And when people look at it, they're quite startled because they think, well, Israelis and Palestinians aren't friends at all. It's a historic conflict and they're never going to get along and they don't ever talk to each other. But then when they look at the data, they go, oh, people actually friend each other on a daily basis. And in fact, during the recent bombings from Gaza, Mark was observing some of the data that was going on, and he could speak to that.
Yeah, so what came out of that you would like to tell us?
Well, so the amount of engagement and friendship across that particular conflict boundary is remarkably resilient. And the first startling thing is it's way more than anybody thinks. And so the worst day in that war, 105 people, I believe, were killed or injured. On that same day, 16,000 and some people friended each other across that boundary. So we seldom see that context. You know, our brains and the media are focusing our context on the bad news.
Now, if you friend someone on Facebook, that doesn't mean you're really a friend, does it? It means you're connecting with them somehow.
That's right. It would mean that you've directed a certain amount of attention and awareness to that person. And so I wouldn't want to make any strong claims about how good that relationship is, but we can say some things about how bad it almost certainly isn't, because we know precisely what happened there was that somebody on one side of the boundary, a Palestinian, for example, publicly requested that an Israeli publicly acknowledge them as a friend, and that Israeli publicly did so. And those two people, we can infer, are probably not the ones shooting at each other.
So now what happens with this data? Can you get into some kind of cycle that the more people friend each other, that leads to still more people friending each other?
Well, one of the things that we've observed in one of the efforts that we're incubating and supporting on Facebook is a program called Israel Loves Iran. And Ronnie Edry, who's a graphic designer out of Tel Aviv, started this in May of last year, where he decided to put up a Facebook campaign saying, "We love you, Iran, we don't want to go to war with you." And what we've done as page administrators and observing the behavior of those people on it is that initially, you know, there was this communication, and between Israel and Iran, they actually have not had any formal communications for 3 decades. And so now what happened was that all of a sudden Israelis were making friends with Iranians. and then they were telling stories to each other, and then they were sharing experiences with each other. So in some ways, this friending behavior, just being able to surface it, is sort of like a gateway behavior to other cordial engagement behaviors.
Now, does this really affect the dynamics of the conflict? I mean, some of these conflicts are pretty deep.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So in the case of Israel Loves Iran, it has gone through a number of iterations. And one of them is the campaign to help influence the elections in Israel, and really getting people rallying around and saying, let's vote for peace. And in fact, in the elections that happened this week, it turned out that it didn't go far right. But in fact, the new government is going to have to build a coalition.
We're talking about January 2013, because
yes.
this show might be seen quite a bit
Right.
into the future.
Right. So we can't indicate causality, but certainly what it's done is it's surfaced the issue, and there's a dialogue. And when we look at the data for that campaign, it has an indirect reach of 20 million people. So people through their social graph, through sharing, through commenting, and so on, they've been able to virally propagate this idea that there should be interaction. And what's interesting about Israel Loves Iran is that it spawned other campaigns, like Israel Loves Palestine, Palestine Loves Israel, and there are about 30 other reciprocal sites. So now other countries where they have a conflict with an adjacent country are also launching similar campaigns, because they go like, wow, this is cool and it works and I like it and I can get people behind it. It's a very simple idea.
Now, I have a lot more questions to ask, but I think we have some slides which we're going to look at.
Sure.
So can we see the first slide, please? So there it is. So what are we looking at here? It says Hack for Egypt.
That's our good friend and colleague Dave Nielsen, who runs CloudCamp on the side and collaborates with us. And,
Is he at Stanford?
He's not. CloudCamp is a nonprofit organization that works with cloud computing around the world, and Dave is one of our collaborators. And he helped us put on a hackathon to build applications to help rebuild Egypt after the Arab Spring in 2010. So that's one example of applications of technology to help support activists.
Okay, so he was supporting the people who were rebelling against the Mubarak government?
Right.
This was post the fall of the Mubarak government, and so the question that we were addressing in that hackathon specifically is, turns out you can use technology to overthrow a government. We didn't know that was possible before. The big question, though, is how do you rebuild the country after that? And
how do you make sure that the new government is better than the previous one?
Right.
Right. And how do you help people do that transition from being told what to do to being able to take an active part in choosing what their country should do and so forth? And so we were doing things like, for example, helping to crowdsource the new Egyptian constitution, building apps to do that, for example, so that people could do a comparative analysis of what they liked about other constitutions around the world and say, we like that article, maybe we could import that into ours.
So it's largely crowdsourcing. Everybody's ideas are put in one central place where everybody can see what everybody else is thinking and talking about, and maybe they're able to use that to advance their own purposes.
That was one of the projects that came out of that hackathon, for example.
Okay, let's see the next slide if we could. Okay.
So this slide was the first image that Ronnie posted on Facebook for Israel Loves Iran. And this was came out of the political rhetoric that was going on in Israel about, this nuclear threat between Israel and Iran. And so Ronnie said, I'm a graphic designer, I object to this, how can I de-escalate it? And it's really interesting because it's an example of citizen diplomacy, and it's an example of citizen psyops. So when we talk to our colleagues in the military, they look at psychological operations and how do you persuade people and how do you move people. So in World War II, they might have dumped a lot of leaflets in a country to persuade people, or radio programs and things of that nature. Now what we see is that individuals can use a platform like Facebook, which is actually a platform for mass interpersonal persuasion, because you can reach millions of people all at once.
Now, who's it who's being persuaded? Because Iran has been pretty threatening toward Israel. They've repeatedly promised to wipe it off the map.
So the the interesting experiment here is that, again, it's part of this bottoms-up trend of individuals saying, well, instead of having this top-down hierarchical approach of individuals collectively coming together and say, like, well, maybe we can oppose this, or maybe we can shift public opinion on our own because we actually have these megaphones like Facebook. Whereas in previous decades, if you wanted to persuade people, you needed to own a media company, or you were a head of state, or you were head of a religion, and you couldn't reach the masses with your message that way. Now an individual like Ronnie can launch a Facebook campaign, touch 20 million people, and not spend a dime.
Well, it seems like the internet is a huge accelerant. It speeds up everything, maybe for both peace and war. It can also accelerate conflict.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Let's look at the next slide if we could.